Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the panel. And our panel is going to be focusing on interior settlements and architecture. And we have two presentations in this panel. Our first presentation is by Dr. Giamila Quattrone, and she's a lecturer in architecture at Liverpool School of Architecture. She holds a PhD architectural technology and recipient of several awards. She has been teaching architectural technology and design studio, also supervising master's dissertations and PhD theses. Her current research revolves around three main areas: settlements, architectural and construction patterns of traditional Oasis settlements of Oman and the Maghreb, with a focus on their spatial and technological transformation as a result of socio-cultural and economic change. She's also looked at the work of Australian architect Glenn Murcutt and the sustainable building adaptive reuse technologies that he has used. Today, she will be sharing with us her research on the traditional Liwan-Type house of the Sinaw Oasis in Oman. And after Dr. Giamila's presentation, we will have Dr. Harriet Nash, who obtained her PhD on the use of stars at night for timing irrigation water in Oman from Exeter University. And she was the first to identify the stars used and recording the methods of how it integrates with the Aflaj technology. And this information from her study is included in the World Heritage Site of the International Union of Astronomy. To put this work in context, she has also looked at the operation and management of Aflaj in the villages that still use stars in the 21st century. Dr. Harriet will discuss settlements in Oman's interior today, and these settlements are still dependent on the Aflaj irrigation system for their initial existence and later development. Although several Aflaj are on the UNESCO World Heritage Site, the 10 or so villages still using stars in the 21st century were not included and have no special protection, so her presentation is going to shed light on that aspect as well. So these two presentations will complement each other, and I think I would request that all of you hold your questions, take a note of any questions that you have, because both presentations will be back to back, and then we will open the floor for discussion. So without any further delay, Dr. Giamila, all yours. I think you're ready. Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you very much for this fantastic introduction. So today, I will be talking about the traditional Liwan-Type house in the Sinaw Oasis in Oman. And this line of inquiry stems from some documentation and research work that as Archiam we did in 2013-14 in Sinaw as part of a documentation heritage management plan effort that was commissioned to us by the Ministry of Heritage and Culture of Oman. Then I stopped thinking about it, and then I thought that this was a very good opportunity to further develop this investigation with the aim of hopefully eventually contributing to the wider project on the traditional Gulf architecture. So looking at a vast, diverse yet interconnected region which spans the Middle East and the Gulf, this paper attempts to trace the typomorphological attributes of the traditional Liwan-Type house of Arat al-Barashid and Arat al-Sawafa in the Sinaw Oasis in Oman, and understand how it relates to the wider landscape of domestic Islamic architecture. These settlements, as I was saying before, were documented in 2013-14, but then after that, a literature review and precedent study of both monumental and domestic scale Liwan buildings from different eras have been employed here to sort of delineate the context, to set the scene, the picture, while typomorphological mapping of the Liwan dwellings of Sinaw has been conducted with the purpose of identifying functional, climatic, but also architectural similarities as well as idiosyncrasies, both within the sample considered, but also, of course, in comparison with foreign examples. According to the Encyclopedia Iranica, Ivan or Avon, palace, veranda, balcony, portico, is a Persian word used both in Arabic and Turkish as both Iwan and Liwan. Whereas the Encyclopedia of Islam lists the following four meanings for this word: a chamber or hall which is open to the outside at one end, either directly or through a portico, an estrade or raised platform, part of a floor, a palace or a very formal and official building, and finally, one of the halls in a religious building, a madrasa or a mosque, which opens on a courtyard. Now, no agreement has been yet reached amongst scholars on where and when the Iwan first emerged. The earliest known examples are found in Persian and Persian-inspired monuments of Iraq in Mesopotamia, such as those of the ancient city of Atra. By the 1st century AD, when a shift from post and lintel construction to vaulting construction is recorded, it was commonly found in temples, palaces, and as well as residences. However, it was during the Sasanian period that the Iwan was extensively used in Persia, both as two similar units facing each other, such as in the Palace of Ardashir first, or as a combination of 4 units around the courtyard, which has been termed as the 4-Iwan plan. An example of this, for example, can be seen, as you can see in the right-hand side bottom corner of the slide, in the much later complex of Sultan Hassan, which comprises a mosque, a madrasa, and a mausoleum. Now, one of the hypotheses correlates the Iwan to the monumental cave-like praying niches carved out of the natural rock in eastern Anatolia, an example of which is found in the Taki Bustan. Now, these cave Iwans coexisted with the monumental Iwans of Sasanian palace architecture. Therefore, it is possibly under the impact of the monumental Sasanian palace at Ctesiphon, known also as Taki Kisra, that art historians, as well as archaeologists, have given the term Iwan a technically precise and narrower meaning, which is that of a single large vaulted or domed hall, walled on 3 sides and opening directly to the outside on the 4th side, where Sasanian kings used to be received. It is in this configuration, normally referred to as the monumental Iwan, that it has been since a recurring feature of Iranian architecture. This function of the Iwan was carried, together with the form, into early Islamic secular architecture, and the Iwan became established, particularly under the Seljuks during the 10th century, as the main form of palace and house architecture from Afghanistan to Egypt. Now, in order to understand how the Sinaw Liwan house may have developed and established itself as a coherent type and how it compares with foreign equivalents, a review of around 30 precedents in various countries has been conducted. The following points can be outlined. First, although occurring also in freestanding houses, like for example in Lebanon and Palestine, the Liwan room as an architectural unit is typically part of a courtyard scheme, so it is integral to the courtyard house scheme. In precedents we found in Turkey, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and UAE, the house tends to enclose the courtyard, and the Iwan is fully incorporated into the plan, so that together they form an integrated whole. Whereas in the Omani precedents we've been looking at, the courtyard tends instead to border the house, providing a protected area which is contiguous with the dwelling spaces, but it's not actually enclosed by them, and therefore functions more as the garden of the house rather than an open-air room, like in the other precedents. The second point is that the Liwan room and the Riwak, which is a covered column gallery which makes up the whole front elevation and in the Gulf is referred to as Liwan, are used, of course, for a number of different purposes, for distribution and circulation purposes, thus providing access to independent rooms that are not often interconnected with each other, as a climatic buffer, so a transition space which is usually strategically located in the southern section of the courtyard, thus facing north, so as not to be directly exposed to, especially to the harsh summer sun, but also to maximize airflow and providing, of course, shading. Then domestic activities, from sleeping, resting, eating, to embroidering, sewing, and even down to storage of produce and agricultural implements, as well as animal shelter. And finally, of course, as a space for social activities, interaction, and gathering with neighbors and family members. As such, in Palestine and Syria, it is often equipped with raised sitting platforms with rugs, mats, and cushions. And in Oman, in fact, we found that often the two extremities of the Liwan are closed in such a way to form a masonry sitting platform, which is called deck. The third point is that the Liwan room's opening is usually never framed, but is treated as a smooth or chamfered return of the adjacent rooms, whereas the Liwan gallery opens either through a trabeated or a columned and arcaded space facade. And finally, the degree of ornamentation in the Liwan room as well as in the Liwan gallery obviously varies substantially across all the countries that we've looked at. Now, the table which is presented here, which we've elaborated within our research group, abstracts from country-specific precedents of Liwan houses by analyzing, diagramming, and classifying the Liwan-Type on the basis of systematically recurring elements and features. The aim is here to see to what extent and how basic types, as well as their typological and morphological variations, as you can see here, but also up there, spans across space and time, so across different countries within the Islamic world, the Middle East and the Gulf region, thus producing comparable domestic spaces in very different, very diverse sociocultural contexts. From this table, if I were to summarize, the following points could be again gathered. Two basic Liwan types can be identified here. The first, which is at the top, basic type A, is a tripartite structure focused on a central arched Iwan room, which is effectively a unit, an architectural unit, a space. The second is a combination, which would be a basic type B, a combination of rooms and a linear columned Liwan. Then we've got one typological variation for each of these two types and their associated morphological and variations for the column Liwan in its L-shape, U-shape, and peristyle configuration. And then finally, one combination type which integrates and pulls together the arched E1 room, so the E1 space, the E1 unit, with the linear columned Liwan, which can be either walled or closed on its sides. And then the presence in the Liwan of a sitting platform, or the Liwan being itself a platform which is raised off the courtyard through a few steps. And finally, the presence in the courtyard of a number of features which range from staircases to balconies, pools, fountains, vegetation, and wells. Moving on to Sinaw, so Oman, which constitutes here the case study, the focus of this line of investigation. Here you see the two settlements of Arat al-Barashid and Arat as-Sawara, these two, the green and the purple one, which form the eastern edge of the Sinaw Oasis, along which the Aflaj runs now north to south. Here you can see where Sinaw is located in the Asharkia governorate, and bear in mind where Adam is, because from a historical point of view they are connected. In fact, when we were doing ethnographic study as part of our documentation effort, conducting interviews with erstwhile inhabitants of these settlements, the local informants we were talking to confirm that the Al-Barashi tribe originally stemmed from the Adam Oasis, but due to a dispute with other local groups, they were forced basically out of the original settlement, and they were sort of obliged to search for a new place to settle down. At the same time, the Awashim tribe in Sinaw was facing a similar situation, and therefore an agreement was reached between these two groups, between these two tribes, to exchange their respective settlements, which is quite an unusual thing to hear about, one for one another, which allegedly happened in the second half of the 17th century. Here you see the settlement plans that we produced at the end of this project, and a stitched panoramic photograph. The settlement's structure is, of course, close-knit, like most of traditional oasis built environments in Oman, and it presents a very winding street pattern. Gradual accretion of the built fabric took place within the confines of the fortified perimeter, the Sur, by building vertically over lanes and streets, so over communal spaces and open passages, thus generating covered passages, as we'll see in a moment. In Arat al-Barashid, the dwelling which we alphanumerically coded as A7, of which you see photos here, and the ground floor plan as well, shown in this beautiful sketch, stands out as the only Liwan house of Arat al-Barashid, and therefore offers an archetypal expression of the type, which would be later copiously replicated in the other settlement, Arat al-Sawafa. The house, as we can see in this axonometric representation, is accessed from the public realm, which would be this street running east to west, into a courtyard. Against the boundary wall leans a tool cell annex, which is this one, which is an animal pen at the front and a kitchen at the back to the south, a staircase, as you can see, leading to the rooftop to the east, and the living quarters to the north. These comprise two small rooms, so it's a very, very basic domestic space, which are aligned in a row and independently accessed from the outside via a flat-roofed, linear-columned Liwan. So this is where what I was presenting before as a type, one of the basic types in the previous comparative table, manifests itself in Arat al-Barashid. The Liwan is closed on both its two short sides, respectively by the staircase on the east and then by the neighboring and adjacent property and dwelling to the west. Whereas a pointed arch arcade, which is closed at the bottom now, here you can't see it, but these two archways are closed at the bottom by a very low solid void pattern curb, forms its facade. Moving on to Sawafa, located north of Barashid, this settlement morphologically differs from the previous one in that it exhibits a comparatively unobstructed street plan, as you can see from the orthophoto, which was produced as well by the team by stitching thousands of stills captured through proprietary microcopter, which we still own. Which may suggest, from a historical perspective, a relatively peaceful history, as well as a possibly more recent development, which we were able, although more vaguely than in the previous settlement, to locate and pin down to sometime in the 18th or early 19th century. The settlement is organized around a central square, which is an open space, as you can see here, more or less having a rectangular plan, from which the main thoroughfares of the settlement spread out in a more or less orthogonal fashion, thus creating, as you can see, clearly delineated housing clusters, which are laid out in both a north, south, and east-west direction. Generally speaking, the houses in Sawafa and these housing clusters are much grander than in Barashid. We are talking here about larger plots, larger built structures, so effectively bigger dwellings, but also larger courtyards, as well as a number of remarkable features, which are to do, for example, with generous arcades, but also, for example, we notice very high quality workmanship, sarouj moldings and inscriptions, particularly on the underside of these arcades. Now, this illustration represents the 13 houses, Liwan-Type houses, that we were able to identify in Arata Sawafa, which feature both plan and section variation of the Liwan house basic type, which we've called type 1, basically consisting in the courtyard, Liwan rooms spatial sequence. Now, the following can be noticed. First of all, the presence of stairs, be they located within the courtyard space or within the actual Liwan, which determines two variations of type 1, as you can see in all these square boxes. Then the presence of external rooms, like annexes, actual outbuildings in a way, which introduces a further level of complexity to these plan layouts, thus defining type 2. The presence of stairs in type 2, which determines two variations of it, and then a unique condition whereby the Liwan coincides with the courtyard and is flanked by rooms on both sides, which determines type 3. Furthermore, a number of architectural types and subtypes can be identified in relation to the Liwan's configuration in elevation, which is based on number and geometry of arches and the Liwan facade style, which determine 4 different types, and then the geometry of the arches and the presence of low partitions within the archways, as well as raised platforms, which determine 5 variations in total. So these are the kind of elements that give a common character to the Liwan houses of Sinaw, and which have led us to kind of group and class them into a coherent whole, a coherent group. Now, Rajat, who has extensively researched these domestic architectural type in the Middle East with a focus on Lebanon, traces the origin of the Liwan in the Bedouin Arab tent. Its interior, he says, was focused on the central area where the occupants would gather and sit in a U-shaped arrangement. Open to the outside, this area provided access, prospect, and refuge, as well as a degree of visual control over the external environment. But most importantly, it functioned as a transition space, as I was saying before, from outside to inside, from public to private, from dazzling sun to darkness. He also maintains that a memory of this U-shaped sitting layout and the central buffer zone was retained when, as nomadic groups settled down, the tent gradually evolved into a courtyard house. So the former, the U-shaped arrangement, according to Rajat, can be traced in the arched configuration of the entrance door, whereas the latter, there is the central buffer area in the protrusion of these living spaces onto the courtyard to form the arcaded portico, which we know as Liwan. But subsequently, as households grew and more space was therefore required, then external rooms were built against the property boundary wall, exactly like it happens in Sinaw, along with the staircases. Now, looking comparatively at the 14 Liwan houses that we've identified between the two settlements, it can be noted that if we were just to focus on the courtyard versus house floor area, so this kind of ratio between the two, that the very large houses have courtyards that take up more than half of the entire house area. The large houses have courtyards that take up around 1/5 of the house area. The medium have courtyards that take up from almost 1/10 to more than 1/3 of the house area. And small houses have courtyards that take up from 1/4 to almost half of the entire house area. So to put this briefly, this means that in very large houses, the courtyard can be fairly spacious and generous in size, even more than the actual built-up area and dwelling space, whereas in large, medium, and small-size houses, it tends to either equal the built-up area or just constitute a small portion of the entire plot. Of course, now, within these research small project, there is a need to understand the rationale behind all of these, and hopefully this will be the next step in that. So to summarize, contrasting the Sinaw Liwan-Type house with the precedents which have been reviewed in other countries, the following tentative points can be drawn: that the house distinguishes itself from being simple in spatial organization, unpretentious in architectural composition, and completely devoid, in this particular case, of ornamentation. Again, except those inscriptions and Sarouj moldings that we were able to see only in some arches. It shares staircases, raised and sitting platforms with the other Middle Eastern precedents considered, but it's lacking in all the rest of features, including balconies, vegetation, wells, pools, and fountains. The Liwan, if we look at the Liwan as a space, this portico space, shares, of course, spatial, functional, and climatic attributes with the other precedents, that which confirms its cultural and environmental responsiveness in these particular hot, dry climate regions. So to conclude, of course, this paper does not purport to convey a comprehensive, neither a conclusive picture of this subject, because it is recognized, it is deemed that there would be a need to substantiate it with a more ethnographic study, to look into trade relationships, tribal movements, and definitely to include more precedents from the region, first of all. So looking at, for example, at the houses, and we were talking about that, how different they are in Minsefa, but also some examples in Mudairib, which we also documented, but whose characters and attributes are very, very different from this particular domestic architecture expression in Sinaw. And therefore be able to understand all the processes and the factors that led to the Sinaw Liwan house and identify any further distinctive aspects. So hopefully this will be the contribution that this area of research can give to the wider traditional Gulf architecture project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, good morning, and thank you, James and Showman, for inviting me here. My presentation about the Aflaj irrigation systems of Oman is mostly based on information collected from 11 settlements with populations of less than 2,000 people during my ethnographic research on the traditional timing of water shares, especially by stars. Following a brief introduction to the Aflaj system, I'll take a look at the uses of water other than for irrigation and some of the associated structures, sundials, and star clocks. Settlements in Oman's interior were dependent on the Aflaj irrigation systems for their initial existence and later development. They date back to at least 2000 BC, and as well as irrigation, provided practically all of the irrigation needs of the community. Most Aflaj were built, shared, and managed by the farming communities and contribute much to Omani's strong sense of identity. There are about 3,000 Aflaj still in use of 3 different types. The red dots, yes, it is working, hang on. Right. No, not right. Can you see the mouse at all? No. Oh, sugar. Right. Right, red dots you can see. Rayleigh Aflaj take water from wadi flow. They are intermittent and of little interest for this presentation. The green dots, Aini, take water from springs, and with Rayleigh Aflaj are within or close to the mountains. The blue dots, is the IT person here? Because I really do need to point. Okay. Dawoodi also depend on groundwater and are similar in construction to the qanats of Iran, with a near horizontal tunnel dug back to the water table, the water surfacing close to the village where it is distributed to the fields. They are found up to 100 kilometers from the mountains, allowing settlement in arid areas. And similar systems are found across arid and semi-arid parts of the world where there are highlands behind with significant rainfall. The blue ovals are areas I have most information from, and I will be referring to, speak out, Hallam and Tamar, Al-Fat, Zahib Mudaybi and Barzaman, Qarya Bani Sub, Miswat al-Abri'in, somewhere up here, Al-Hamra and Adam. The main channel is divided to serve the cultivated area where date palms are the most important crop. Although individuals own or rent water shares, the water is free for anyone to use for domestic purposes. Traditionally, drinking water for people was taken first at the Sharia, then for ablutions at the mosque, followed by facilities for bathing. But in modern times, at least, the order is quite mixed. This Aini Falaj in Qarya Bani Sub is thought to be about 1,000 years old and the oldest in the area of Al-Hamra. The old village is in two parts, with the Sharia downstream of one. And there is also upstream use by pastoralists and a mosque, one of the three official stargazing points, which are the circles. The sundial can be located in any convenient place, here downstream of the main cultivated area. The Sharia signifies purity. Once the source of drinking water, it is now used as a car wash, laundry, hammam, whatever, but still respected and maintained. Often it is a simple bench or step in the side of the channel, but sometimes more elaborate on the right, as in Mudaybi. The hammams are used to this day. Even if dilapidated, the presence of soap and the odd sandal shows that many of them have not been abandoned and, bottom right, have even been renewed in modern times. The mughsila is for washing dead people. It was simply a bench or two on the side of the channel, as top left, using a pallet to place the body over the water. Some are inside small buildings, top right in Al-Fat. And although most people now lay out the dead in their own houses, in Mudaybi, bottom left, and Barzaman at least, there are modern facilities for communal use, still taking water from the Falaj. Bottom right is a mughsila in Mintarib. No, sorry, this is Mudaybi. This is not used by the townspeople, but by Bedu living in the Wahiba sands to the south, but they share the same cemetery. You will often see steps to access water, especially it seems for washing dishes, and in Zahib, bottom left, food, a fish there. People wash themselves and their clothes in the channel, and children can chill out. The official plea, bottom left, not to wash clothes or dishes in the Falaj have clearly fallen on deaf ears. The Falaj water runs continuously, and the distribution is timed to ensure that each farmer gets their fair share. The method used was agreed by the community to minimize disputes over water. So most communities use the sun by day and stars by night for this purpose. And the sundial is still used in many places. The details of how this is carried out are generally not written down and have to be established through observation and interviews. This is the sundial at Qarya, where the space between two red lines 2 red markers, red lines, marks a saham 3/4 of an hour, whereas 2 white lines is an asr, about half an hour. Yasser, so Yasser is waiting for the shadow of the tip of the pole to reach his marker, for the tip of the pole to reach his personal marker, at which point he will go to the channel, move any sluices needed to get the water onto his land. And some other examples of sundials. Top right is a fairly simple one in Al-Fat, where you might see some personal markers on the ground. On the left, a more sophisticated example in Taima, where a conch shell is blown to tell people when to take their water. In Hallam, bottom right, the sundial is provided by clefts in the rock. This just shows one of them. In Adam, there are 6 Aflaj, each with its own sundial. Some are small and simple, as bottom. The largest is more complex and unusually bounded by a low wall. Much time and concentration are needed to place one's marker. Some of you will recognize Ali al-Mahrougi on the right, and his uncle Mohammed is on the left. Another important space is the auction room. In Al-Fat, on the left, auctions are quite somber. But in Qaria, fun is had by all. Will this work? Is there any sound? There's no sound. Oh.
You can probably, I think we have this.
Oh, hang on. You can just about hear it. I think some of the jokes might have been to impress me, but anyway. So a similar procedure is followed at night. Once the stars show that it is time, the farmers divert the water to their land. By about 2008, the number of communities using stars had dwindled from thousands to about 10. I'll explain a little about star use for you to understand what follows, using Qaria as an example. The simplest method is to watch the horizon. The time between the rise of any 2 stars is constant, so they can be used as a very accurate watch. There are 21 main stars, and the period named after the star starts when it is the last to be seen rising at dawn. On any one night, several main stars may be seen, and many divider stars are used to give divisions down to 5-minute intervals, which means that you have to be able to recognize about 60 stars. In Misfat al-Abri'in, which stopped using stars in about 1970, 4 towers were built to help people with poor eyesight identify the main stars, from Chui, Vega, in the north, to Al-Aqrab and Taris in the south. The 5th must have already been there, presumably for Al-Miazin, bottom middle, which is a divider star, not a main star. Other towers on the ridge are said to be tombs, all built by copycat children. In Barzaman, in the Mudaibi area, the stars are watched rising above a wall. The location for watching was changed in the 1970s to be closer to the new village. You start at the western edge of the road, and once the star has risen, move forwards to watch it rise at a later time. This continues for about 1 hour, and the rise of another star is again first watched from the western side of the road. Throughout the year, only 24 stars have to be identified. Divider stars are not needed because you can stop at any point along that line, allowing divisions as short as a few minutes. According to Sheikh Sultan al-Habsi, The Aflaj, and hence the town of Al-Fat, is over 1,000 years old. Here, top right, a small mosque and its surrounds are used at night. This system is also based on 24 main stars, but a more complex method is used, with several walls and at least 40 points to stand and watch, not the main Aflaj stars, but indicator stars, which mark the time of rise of the main star above the natural horizon. For the tower, a Zahra capella is watched rising above the top of the tower for about 2 hours, during which time the main stars, Ash'ara, Ajamb, and Zira'ain, rise above the natural horizon. Most of the points for watching are inside the compound. And although the system appears complex, it is only necessary to know 5 or 6 stars, usually the brightest and most easily recognized. So inside the gate, on the left, Ash'ara, Sirius here, is watched rising above the wall, while on the right, Zacharain, Arcturus, is watched for different main stars. Through the arch, the whole of the outer wall is used to watch stars setting. There are several personal markers. On the top left, there's a crisp packet and 2 rows of markers for different stars at different times. On the south wall below, there are several stones along the top as personal markers. Here, Muhammad al-Habsi is demonstrating how he watches the star setting, moving backwards, each point marking roughly half an hour. A similar system is used in Zahib along an east-west oriented path. Between buildings. Zahib was established in about 1910 as a satellite of Mudabi, but the building on the south is older. The walls on the south, here and here, have 3 rows of markers. Stars are watched setting over this wall from here, rising over this post from that wall, and from here watched rising above the top of the tower. Some of the points from that first wall I pointed out are shown below. For one wall and one round, this is how it works. That's for Barzaman, moving forward. Here watching a Dabran rising above the post for 2 main Aflaj stars, Ash'ara and Al-Jamb. Most communities stopped using stars in the early 1970s when wristwatches became widely available, since when light and dust pollution have been major factors in the decline of the practice. And this is a physical example of deterioration. This wall was used for Adhara'ain, the 2 arms, Regulus and Algeba, watching Sirius rise above the tower on the house opposite. But in the summer of 2008, the wall was demolished to make way for a new building, and everyone started using their watches for this part of the cycle. Since then, in Zahib and Al-Fat, the people with most knowledge of the star system have died, and star use has stopped. They are now used only by about 8 Aflaj communities. So this rare practice will soon be extinct. And although several Aflaj are inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage Site, and I have a book from the Ministry of Water here if anyone wants to look, they do not include any of those using stars in the 21st century. So there is no real protection for the material or oral heritage associated with this practice. And I hope that the Qatar National Library project will help to at least provide a permanent record of its existence.
Thank you very much for the 2 very, very enlightening and different papers, but I can see lots of connections in my head. Before we do any of our own dissection, I would like to open the floor for any questions for any of the speakers. Any questions? No? Good. I can ask all my questions then. So, two things that I noticed, and I think it's fascinating that both of you are looking at heritage from a very different perspective than usually conservationists look at. For both of you, it's not just representing something, it actually is something that is alive in the contemporary period. So how would you see one way of looking at the Aflaj system is to look at it as it's representing the way in which society is related to each other. But how do you think in the contemporary period you would push some other ideas about extending that knowledge, that indigenous knowledge about the stars, about the water, into the contemporary realm? And in the same vein, I think to Dr. Giamila, I would ask if you would extrapolate also from the indigenous knowledge that you are researching on these interior settlements, how would it be able to guide some design principles into the contemporary period? So both of you, whichever wants to go first.
I see this, the practices I have been recording are dying and will die out, but if recorded and disseminated, they can provide lessons on cooperation, sharing resources, and the Ministry of Water Resources encourages this so that people, in theory at least, manage their own water resources. It doesn't work very well in practice, though.
For me, it's like, of course, we know that the courtyard house scheme, at least in Oman, has been totally neglected and overlooked. You know, mass housing has followed a totally different direction. We have very large size villas, which obviously translate the more nuclear family type of aggregation that has been the reality in Oman and I guess in other Islamic and Gulf countries over the last 40 or 50 years, which hasn't translated, hasn't taken into the future any of the lessons, any of the elements, whether they are architectural elements or environmental lessons or lessons of cultural relevance and appropriateness. I don't know whether it is possible. I think it is possible. And in the end, the design work that we've tried to push in our work attempts to reinterpret what these underlying principles and lessons are, which is not necessarily something that is physically manifested, that it's not about copying, it's not about replica, it's not about creating any pastiche, it's about understanding what these spaces and what the values about these spaces were. In the case of the Liwan, it would be, for example, the fact that a lot of different activities would take place in these pleasant if compared to the rest of the courtyard house space. So it's environmental soundness, it's cultural relevance. This element of transition between the outside and the inside, I think, has totally gone lost. There are ways, I mean, contemporary architecture, and if I look at the work that I've been in parallel researching over the last 14 years or so, the work of Australian architect Pritzker Price Glenn Murcutt, but a bunch of other contemporary Australian architects, they have reinterpreted the essence, the identity, these underlying principles of their indigenous architecture, which was not. Partly, they have taken lessons from the Aboriginal culture, which was the very indigenous culture of Australia, and partly, of course, they had to look at the colonial architecture of the British period in Australia. So, for example, if you look at the way they have reinterpreted the veranda space of the colonial veranda, the colonial cottage, which was imported via India by the British into Australia. It's amazing to see how they have understood the essence of the space and the attributes, the qualities of this space, and some of them have created houses which are effectively called veranda houses. So the lifestyle that that particular space promotes is very close to what the veranda space would have allowed the inhabitants of Australia during the British colonial period to have. So I think it is possible, but of course it needs courage, and it needs people who are able to steer away from the current direction that building, whether it's mass building or architectural, contemporary architectural production has taken place in many of these countries, I'm afraid.
Thank you both for your answers, but I have a follow-up question, unless there is other questions from the... Okay.
I want to thank you both for the great lecture. For Giamila, I have a question about, you said that you wanted to look into more rationale that comes into understanding where the houses came from, or the typology. And I was wondering, because you were talking about the whole contemporary state, how do you see computational design coming? Because the way that you've put out stuff, it seems to be very logic-based, that could be embedded into certain systems that maybe could give us a way forward of how we can look at things coming in for the future. So this becoming more of a foundation for a generative design. So have you kind of looked into ways of how that could be embedded, or?
I don't think there is one recipe for different countries and different local conditions. For example, what we have recently done in Misfata Labrin with an adaptive reuse design project, where we have taken 3 built structures. We were asked to adaptively redesign these 3 structures. So looking at, for example, the typology, the way this architecture was configured, the way the plan layout was structured, how internal spaces versus terrace spaces or semi-outdoor spaces were used, looking at the construction, for example, at the materials, looking at the way people would move and transit from an outdoor communal space into a very private realm. So looking at what the architecture was really about and how it was made, we have tried to see what the most sympathetic way of still continuing that and preserving that, but instilling a new life into this building. So we were asked to turn what effectively were 3 domestic buildings, so 3 private houses, into one a restaurant, one a kitchen and bakery, and the other one an information point, which inevitably a change in program, which on the other hand is, as we were saying during the previous days of the conference, is possibly the only way for ensuring that this continued and sustained life of heritage building. So inevitably it was a change in program takes you to come up with new plan layouts, for example, so you end up modifying. But of course, then it goes down to the architect's sensitiveness to decide to what extent and where the limit lies, the boundary between retaining something as it is, as you've inherited it, and altering it in such a way that it allows the new program to take place, so it accommodates the new use, while also allowing people who are not necessarily locals, so these structures were meant and are meant to cater for locals, for the community, the local community, as well as for visitors and tourists who are not necessarily close to that culture, who necessarily don't understand it, to grasp, to get a sense of how traditional life would have happened in these spaces, how people would have moved around, how people would have sheltered and protected themselves in what time during the day or the seasons, and all of that.
I have one follow-up question. In the context of Oman, what is, and first to Dr. Harriet, if the Aflaj system is still in operation, then what are the barriers for the continuation of the indigenous knowledge that you just shared? Why do you assume it's on its way to dying? Or what is the challenge? What is the hurdle? Why is its death imminent?
Well, there are maybe 8 or less places still using stars. Although each farmer would know their star, they do depend on someone with much deeper knowledge, more detailed knowledge, settling any disputes, someone they can check with. Those people die, the practice stops. The sundials do continue to be used because they're good meeting places. But even they go. The one in Garriat Beni Sub is no longer used because it was too difficult to maintain, being in the middle of a road. So that will stay longer. There's also the factor of people now having an education, moving to the towns. The Aflaj is not all their life, almost the whole of their life. There are many people in the urban areas who know nothing about what goes on in terms of what I've just spoken about. So I just don't see it staying. People become more diverse. They're importing food.
You used the phrase middle of the road, right? Something is in the middle of the road. So the sundial, which is in the middle of the road, right? How did it get to be in the middle of the road?
Well, presumably it wasn't always tarmacked, but it was quite a convenient wide space where, you know, all that detail could go in. And when I first visited it, it had just been freshly painted, which is when I took that picture, and great pride in it. After a few years, they'd given up. But why?
So what is the challenge?
Well, I don't think you can stop this deterioration. Things change. But I think one thing which maybe could be done is to make people in these communities more aware of their own culture. To them, it's just, you know, day by day. They don't realize. Some people don't realize how unique it is. So just the fact of me being there made people appreciate what they were doing much more than previously, but not for very long. The effect probably lasted about 6 months.
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Giamila, I think, again, can I just, for one more question? Sorry about that. So, what are the policy issues that are preventing from distilling this knowledge into new architecture? Building setbacks, and please, Omani architects, chime in. Setbacks.
And that was the norm for a long time. Sorry. And that was the norm for a long time. But now we are starting to see this. I mean, individuals wanting to go back to courtyard housing, and the difficulty is that the setbacks are imposed at a legislative level. You need to have the setbacks for privacy and for this harmonious urban continuity of the street, addressing the street. But what is starting to happen is, as architects and as clients are requesting this, we are starting to defend the courtyard house, and whenever it's possible, the authorities are starting to make exceptions. So these things are starting to happen.
How can these exceptions become the norm?
I think these kind of events are really, really important.
Thank you very much.
And you know, the way that the work is being done and the way that it's being presented and the diagrams and the infographics, these things are really important because they engage with the younger generation. You know, younger, not just architects, but in Oman, for example, I don't know how things are in Qatar, but in Oman, every single Omani gets a piece of land, a housing land. So everyone builds, and everyone is engaged with their traditional architecture. And as long as these stories are maintained and you can demonstrate that, you know, the Liwan is still relevant and it's still important and it still is it's still relevant for their daily use. You know, you could sit there on your mobile phone and, you know, do social media. You can drink your coffee there. It's still usable. Then these things will be asked for, and people will come to us as architects and ask for these things and ask how these things can be incorporated in a modern way, and that's how the dialogue can continue.
I think, Shoman, you want to
Just add to that. I think this is where I feel theorization is so important, you know, because we tend to shy away from historical theory. And this is where, what if we did that? Speculation and theorization is crucial. And I think if we look at, and I think we were talking yesterday with somebody, it's just that there's so little of one's own history and one's own theory being taught in schools of architecture, in urban planning, in you know, in the training programs, say the Muscat municipality holds or the Qatar municipality holds, and so on. I think there is very, very little of one's own history and one's own historical theory being discussed. It's very important that that is put in the curriculum, so that the students who are coming out of it are not learning about, you know, what happened in a remote past of which is they never see, you know, of Switzerland's corner, but really about one's own courtyard, you know. And that, I feel, would be really very important. And to be able to ask then those questions about how, you know, because clearly the Liwan was also associated with some kind of nomadic sort of transition. Hence, I mean, the big question is, why is it in Sinaw and not elsewhere? The other thing is that Islamic courtyards are not always present in Oman at all, you know, so there are other questions as well. So there are sort of interesting, but nomadic lifestyle has never left us, you know, so how do we understand that, and how do we then bring in a kind of a special condition that supports that sort of thing? It would be very important to develop that whole body of knowledge, which can then support it, and then can also say, well, hey, you know, can I get the sundial back? Can I get the, you know, the star system back? You know, that would be really
In Urida, another of Mudebi's satellite towns, which were built because they needed new Aflaj for the population, the astronomer from Sultan Qaboos University comes from there. They stopped using stars in 1970, and about 10 years ago asked Saleh Shadhani if he could come up with a schedule exactly the same as they would have used with the stars, but using a watch. And he said it was about impossible to do. There's clearly this sort of, with some communities, a hankering after the tradition because it was trusted. It was agreed, and more people trusted it more.
Yeah, no, it's, and I think the government has done some useful work. I was at the hotel, you know, having. I normally switch on the telly, and one of the things that I saw with two channels on Oman, one was culture, Omani culture, Oman culture or something like that, and then there was the next one contiguous to it, which is another one. And they run pretty much continuously, and the quality of the programs have gone up quite significantly. Abdullah Al-Ghafri was there on, you know, talking about the Aflaj systems and everything. I think, but there is a lot more detailed description and so on, which hopefully will reach the local population better. And that, I think, is that public communication is crucial. So it's getting better, I think, I would say. Optimism is important.
Thank you. We can continue at lunch. Doctor, yeah? Thank you. But thank you very much for a very stimulating panel.